Morning all, let's have a look at the round 1 game this morning between Gawain Jones and Michael Adams. Gawain Jones, the lowest rated player in this very strong tournament, but the current British champion for 2012. He's up and coming Grandmaster. He was playing in the FIDE Open last year, and that was dominated actually by Gupta. There was a key game he lost to Gupta in the FIDE Open, but Gawain's results have been increasingly good in recent years, and this was a very interesting test against Michael Adams, who had won actually the British Championship the 2 years before Gawain, so in 2011 and 10. But Michael Adams has been over 2700 for a number of years. It's rock solid, steady style of play. So let's see that rock solid, steady style of play in this game and how Gawain handled it. So d4 from Gawain, playing white. By the way, myself and Paul Georgiou took a draw from Gawain in a 5-minute tournament last year, and Paul Georgiou managed to beat him. So these players are not invincible at blitz chess, but the longer they're given, the more dangerous they become. So anyway, so knight f6 was played by Michael Adams. After c4 e6, we have actually a Nimzo-Indian emerging. My only encounters with Michael Adams, by the way, at blitz or friendlies, he destroyed me, absolutely, completely destroyed me. He is a brilliant blitz player, Michael Adams, and has been since junior times. I'm the sort of same age group as him. I remember him mopping up a 5-minute tournament, British Juniors 5-minute tournaments. It was amazing to watch. Okay, so anyway, getting on with the game. E3 from Gawain, the Rubinstein variation, and now after castles knight ge2, which I think Gawain had used successfully in the British Championship with a fantastic game. So this is an interesting idea, avoiding the damage to the pawn structure. Black plays now d5. After a3, Black doesn't really want to give up the bishop pair for absolutely nothing, really. So it goes back to d6, which might seem as though, isn't White going to gain a lot of space on the queen side with c5? c5 is usually controversial. Structurally, it's very interesting to consider what happens after c5. Just from a fundamental point of view, bishop's retreating. Black later usually plays e5, then maybe even e4, and under that structure, White might get the f4 square. And you can imagine if f3 would be controversial in that structure, because you get a backward pawn on the e file. So sometimes maybe if you play like that as White, it's kind of playing like a reverse French, where f3 is a little bit more controversial than usual perhaps. Okay, and that's similar to what actually happened in the game from a fundamental pawn structure perspective. But let's see. Okay, so c5 was actually played. So the problem, as I say, is this e5 coming in later from Black, because also you can imagine d4 being slightly more vulnerable in some lines as well if there is ed, but sometimes there is just the option of e4. So moving on, b4, and we see b6, which, okay, it might not actually be directly undermining the pawn chain. It's going to be recharged at c5 very easily, but that b file could be useful for either White or Black later for some strategic operations, or simply to simplify the position. If White has a space advantage, maybe it's in Black's interest, for example, to simplify the position using the b file later to get the rooks off, and just be nagging at White's weaknesses. That's an interesting concept generally, that it's not really just about undermining the pawn chain here. This b file is an operation for just exchanges. It sounds a bit dull, but White has the space advantage here, so if Black can prove and encourage weaknesses and torture White with those weaknesses later, that's a valid plan. So knight f4. Okay, now knight f4 looks like putting pressure on d5 to stop e5 in its tracks. And now we see the move c6. Now reinforcing d5 like this means actually that maybe e5 is again later on the cards. Bishop e2, knight bd7, and black is actually threatening strategically e5 immediately here. So he can't just routinely castle. I mean, that would be very, very pleasant for black to play e5 here in this position. White's next move seems to be designed against that, bishop b2, because now there's tactical ideas on e5 like taking and a knight d5 for bishop takes e5. So it's indirectly keeping a watch over e5 here instead of the routine castling. Queen c7, as though now e5 is again on the cards, it's supported by the queen. White now castles, and now b takes c5, which is recharged by the b pawn. Don't want to let black have a dominating centre, even though visually it might appear it's extending the scope of the bishop. This centre black would have, I think, would be great. So b takes c5, keeping trying to keep a lock on e5, but it's played now, or just generally dark square pressure and keeping using this pawn instead to try and eye these squares. Okay, so e5 is played here. Now after knight d3, here is an interesting point strategically. Does black actually want to play something like ed? Well, actually Michael Adams chose e4, even though ed might be tempting to weaken d4. e4 is gaining a bit of space, but also this is an aggressive pawn chain, and this bishop can actually be rerouted potentially on this diagonal, as we might see later in this game. So there are some perks of having this aggressive pawn structure, and it's almost like a reverse French defense type structure. But okay, with this bishop on b2 though, it's locked in by its own pawn chain. We see knight f4, and okay, black might be tempted even for g5 at some point, but that can be kept in reserve. It's not needed. White's got adequate replies here, like knight h5 for example. Rook e8 is played, rook b1. Now knight f8, so revealing the manoeuvring going on here, that the knight can come to g6 to threaten to damage white's pawn structure, or gladly accept double pawns. And you might think, why would black really want those double pawns? Well, it simplifies, it avoids congestion issues. This bishop is now freer, and then black can try and get, I think he wants to get the light squared bishops off to try and weaken white's light square control here. This aggressive pawn formation is looking at the light squares here, so if these guys can be taken off, then the weaknesses can start to be tortured in white's position. f3 is played here, which seems a little bit controversial. It does leave potentially a backward pawn and gives black potentially a useful f5 square to work with this bishop along this diagonal. So, but the perks for white could be the g file and later e4, but that would come at a dangerous cost for d4, one would think. So how weak are white's pawns going to get with f3? That will probably decide the outcome of this game. Black did take on f3. There's not too many choices here. Doesn't want to let white enjoy an f file for nothing. So e takes, and if white tries to enjoy the f file, it's at a big cost with a backward pawn now on that semi-open e file. So g takes f3 here was the idea. Now we see bishop d8 with the intention potentially of this bishop coming to this diagonal once the queen moves. Bishop c1 is played, because also bishop d8 is actually threatening immediately to take that pawn. So bishop c1 looks like a passive move, but it's necessary to protect the pawn. How else to protect the pawn? There are other ways, but maybe queen d3, maybe there was a5 for bishop a6, or even g6 for bishop f5. So maybe queen d3 is not ideal for defending e3 there. So bishop c1, humble move, looking move. Knight g6, So the first exchange of pieces here. Now, what's happened with this exchange? Okay, black's structure doesn't look ideal, but on the other hand, there's quite a defensive pawn on g6. It does support bishop f5. Black does, in theory, want to get rid of the light square bishops because he's still got control, of these two squares. If he can try and soften white up on the light squares, that'll be fine. And also, king safety is not going to be an issue if he can exchange off the light square bishops in particular. This is the more dangerous bishop. A move like earlier, queen a4 and bishop a6 would also maybe threaten later an infiltration or something to do with the light squares. But now, after bishop d3, Michael Adams willingly plays bishop f5, not minding an exchange here. This would be kind of like a bind on e4 if it's taken, so it's not rook f2. And we see queen c8 just supporting f5 now without having to take back with the pawn. Just can take option, take back the queen, and the bishop can come to this diagonal. So nice rerouting of pieces. Knight g3, and now an exchange of light squares. So is white being softened up here? Queen h3, immediate threat. Bishop takes g3. It seems pleasant enough, this position for black. Queen h4. Not minding any infiltration at the moment. He's still threatening bishop g3. That has to be dealt with. Queen g2. Protecting g3. Rook ab8 now. So the b file is now being used to get rid of the rooks. And here we do see the rooks leaving the scene. They make an exit now. Both pairs of rooks gone. So who's better in this position? You might think this is a dry game. It's not going to make the most brilliant games of all time list. You might be right. But this is how high level games are often won. It's about torturing weaknesses over a number of moves, especially with the possibility of increments and a large classical time control. The London Chess Classic is all about classic chess, and they've stuck to the old 40 moves in 2 hours, then another hour and 20 or whatever and then even in the final stage there's an increment. This is proper classical time control FIDE chess, not speeded up with the latest FIDE innovations. And in this classical chess there's time to really torture opponents. Okay, so how can black really torture white here with these weaknesses? What are the maneuvers which are going to be useful? Well, okay, there's also concrete threats. Even in this simplified position, there's concrete threats to deal with. Bishop d2 now has a concrete threat, maybe a bishop a5, and that would be quite nasty with options of bishop d8 all the time, for example. So that's parried. Bishop e1. That's not threatening anything at the moment. That knight's pinned. Knight h7. As though there's an interest potentially in either getting out of the way of the queen, maybe to f6, and then the knight can come maybe to g5, maybe. Okay, so king f1, queen f6, queen e2, knight g5, trying to torture f3 to start off with. Now, if king g2, then maybe just queen e6. It's difficult already, this f3. And here white commits now to a move which you might not think is that dangerous, but potentially it is. f4 is played, and we see now after knight e6, black has a constant threat of dissolving the double pawns using f4 as a way of doing it. It's an easy target here. Immediately g5 is actually threatened. Maybe this next move just gets out of the way of g5 to be able to answer it with various things like f5. Queen e7. Okay, and potentially if this knight wants to move, there's knight d4, so the king comes to protect the queen again. Bishop d8, and it seems as though there's nothing going on here for a moment. Queen a6, queen d7, king e2, bishop h4. Is there an interest in taking away this knight versus bishop ending? Well, we see that question raised here, and the answer is given now. No, not particularly. Knight f8, keeping both pieces on the board here. Michael Adams didn't feel that was enough to give up voluntarily the dark square bishop, but there's an invitation here to exchange off the dark square bishops. Does he like this invitation? Yes, he does here. These exchanges, as mentioned earlier, do they reveal or encourage the torturing of weaknesses? That's the key question. We're at move 42 now. Expect a very long grind from this position. So knight h7, as though g5 is being prepared to just dissolve these pawns. King d2, g5 is indeed played, and in dissolving the pawns, well, that makes these pawns more flexible, more agile, and maybe emphasizes more white's weaknesses. Knight g3, black takes, and we see with e takes, with that departure of the e pawn, d4 is slightly weaker, f4 is slightly weaker. Isolated pawns. Knight f6 and a nice hook on e4, f5, closing up against that diagonal, but white's been softened up here for sure. There's another access point here to get the queen here to attack d4 potentially. Queen c2, king c2, but here, if the queen ventures in, there's a potential check and taking on c6. So this next move is against that check. It seems prophylaxis against the queen c8 to give the possibility of queen f4. We see king b1, and now actually knight g4, concrete threat taking here, and queen f4 looks like a menace. Queen f1 protecting f4 and indirectly protecting h2 because of queen h3 check. King g8 now really threatening knight h2. Queen e2 protecting h2, attacking the knight. Knight goes back. Queen a6, knight g4, cat and mouse. Queen e2, knight f6, queen a6. Does black want to draw? No. King f8, avoiding threefold repetition. And now after queen d3 here, queen a5, and it looks slightly uncomfortable that black has got the pressure on white's pawns and not vice versa. Black staring into white's position, trying to torture these weaknesses. Queen e3 protecting e1, the e1 square. King g8. But remember, this pawn is still marking light squares. Can black do something with this a pawn in this position? How can black improve the position? King b2, king h7. For the moment, seeing what's happening, queen a6, queen b7. Nothing too committal, you'd think, is happening here. Now a5, and now this is something happening all of a sudden. This pawn is marking these light squares. This pawn wants to mark the b3 square from a4. If that can be marked, a later queen b3 is going to be a bit of a menace for this a pawn potentially, and that's the case now. So king c2, a4, tying down the queen now concretely because of queen b3. Queen e3, queen b8, keeping an eye on both b3 and now this diagonal. Queen f3, king f8, queen e3. Now knight e8. Where is this knight heading? Nowhere in particular at the moment. Okay. Queen b5. Okay, now if this knight moves, maybe queen f1 is dangerous, but also queen c4. Black is staring into white's position. White has these weaknesses to try and pick off and try and win a pawn at some point. King c1, check, 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 and now we see a ferocious move all of a sudden. Black has been accumulating some advantages, some marking of light squares here, and this culminates now in this next move. Knight e4. The queen is starting to get overloaded to b3. If takes queen b3, winning a3, it's pretty nasty. This is looking very bad all of a sudden now. So f6, it looks a little bit desperate, this combination, to play f6. Okay, if takes, that will be dangerous for knight f5 and queen h6, but takes with the knight. Black's a pawn up for the first time now in this game. Knight f5, there looks to be dangerous threats like queen e7, but it's black's turn. Check. Now blocking the e file. It's a miserable position all of a sudden. H4 check, 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 Queen F1 hitting the knight. White's going to lose another pawn now, knight d6, losing another pawn. This is a tactical vulnerability on d6 because of check, check, and now Queen h2 check, powerful double attack. The grind is netting now 2 pawn advantage potentially, but throwing a couple more checks before taking on d6 like that. 2 pawns up. It's pretty bad. 2 pawns up. Queen h3, g6 gives the king g7. Whoops. g7 to work with on the queen c8. Queen f3, king g7. Queen e3, Queen f6, and White's had enough of this torture, and being 2 pawns down doesn't encourage White to play on either. It was a grind, a 91 move grind. It's not going to be in the most brilliant games of all time, but it's one of those things which makes a top grandmaster like Michael Adams, be so consistently at the top of his game. He's a true professional. Professionals sometimes do play these grinding, riskless games. Grinding, 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 getting the weaknesses exposed, winning 1 or 2 pawns, and that's it. Breaking the resistance of opponents. I'm not really sure we should do a second pass into this game for fear that I might give up chess through lack of excitement. So, and I don't want to inflict that on you as well. I think if you want to review the video with an engine, please do. I'll give the PGN in the description of the video. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.